I was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, August 21st, 1897, into moderately well-to-do family circumstances. I lived my childhood in that city, happily, but without distinguishing events. In 1915, I went to Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, and graduated from that college in 1919. Incidentally, during 1918, I spent a few months in the Army, which makes me, rather ludicrously, a veteran of 2 world wars in the technical sense. After graduating from college in June 1919, I had no more idea what I was going to do next than most young men have, I think. And for 2 years, I worked at 2 or 3 different jobs, one of them in the factory of the Dalton Adding Machine Company in Norwood, Ohio. But none of these things were very satisfying, and in the fall of 1921, motivated, I think, largely by the fact that a good many of my college friends had previously entered Harvard Law School, I followed them there and graduated from Harvard Law School in 1924. Following that, I went back to Providence and worked in a fairly large law office there for about 6 years, until the death of my parents in 1930 made it necessary for me to return to Cincinnati, where I lived from 1930 to 1933, very largely engaged in the settlement of my mother and father's estate and the estates of several other deceased members of their families. This was a very complicated performance and was tiring to me and not very rewarding. Although my legal studies and my academic work in college had little or nothing to do with archaeology, I had always had a kind of semi-romantic idea of what an archaeologist was. I was interested in the past and in history, and the idea of digging in the dirt was appealing. And during my period in Cincinnati in the early 30s, I became acquainted through mutual friends with an eminent classical archaeologist, Carl Blagan, who at that time was at the University of Cincinnati and had been engaged throughout his life in the excavation of Greek classical and pre-classical sites. At this particular time, he was engaged and would continue for several years in the excavation of Troy, Homer's Troy, Schliemann's Troy. I was enticed by this and was invited by Dr. Blagan to join the Trojan expedition, but because of my personal circumstances and the family complications, I couldn't do it at that time. However, this contact did revivify or crystallize in my mind an interest and a desire to continue with some form of archaeological research. And inasmuch as I had broken my ties with Rhode Island and my legal activities had terminated, it seemed to me that this was a good time to do something about it, although I didn't know exactly what. I had heard of, though I had not met, Paul Martin, who was anthropologist then, on the staff of the Field Museum in Chicago. So I made contact with Dr. Martin and talked to him about the possibility of joining him, although I had no particular academic qualifications, on his summer expedition into southwestern Colorado. I found Dr. Martin very cordial, and we became good friends. He permitted me to join his expedition, quite frankly, as a laborer and a learner, and this turned out in the long run to be the beginning of a whole new life for me. At that time, Paul Martin had been digging in southwestern Colorado in the general Mesa Verde culture area for a number of years. First for the Denver Museum and then for the Field Museum in Chicago. In the summer of 1933, I drove to his camp, which was situated about 20 miles northwest of Cortez, Colorado, in a small community which was then known as Sylvan. Sylvan and the surrounding countryside and the people who inhabited it were to me something totally new in the world and wonderful beyond anything that I had imagined. I think that that summer in Colorado was more important to me in, shall I say, the social or sociological sense, the opening of my eyes to a world that I had never known before, than was my specific interest in archaeology as such. Maybe a little word about the community of Sylvan will not be amiss. That area, which is about 15 miles northwest of Cortez, was at that time all not too far removed from the frontier. It had been homesteaded at the time of the First World War, and a good many of the homesteaders were still living there, most of them in comparative poverty, some in actual sod houses with dirt floors. Others had prospered a little bit through the raising and the clearing of the country of sagebrush and the developing of pinto beans. Dove Creek, a little town not far north of Sylvan, later became somewhat famous and was known as the pinto bean capital of the world. Well, I found when I got to Sylvan that Dr. Martin and 2 or 3 others of his staff were living at the home of a Mr. and Mrs. Clyde Long. The Longs deserve a word, and I'll come back to them later. However, on the day of my arrival, which was early July, activity at the Lowry ruin, which Dr. Martin was excavating, had been suspended. This was due to a difficulty with the owner of the land, a illiterate but awesome man named McKendry Foster. A good many of the people who had homesteaded this area and who were still living there had come into that country through the, well, what later became known as the Okie Channel. They were mostly people out of East Tennessee who had migrated westward via Arkansas, Oklahoma, eastern Colorado, and finally into southwestern Colorado. And as I say, some of them were illiterate and all pretty tough people, as they had to be to survive. Well, the reason that we were not allowed temporarily to dig at the ruin was because of the fact that Mr. Foster, who did not yet own the land because he had not yet proved up his homesteading obligations, nevertheless forbade our entry upon the land. The reason, as I recall it, being that Paul Martin's large Pierce Arrow touring car had, a few days before, run over and smashed one of Mr. Foster's cattle guards. This enraged Mr. Foster, and according to Paul, though I didn't see this, Foster took after him with a gun. When I arrived, the situation was in suspense, and Paul had requested assistance from the Department of the Interior. This is because the land was still public land, not yet patented to Foster, and therefore the permit to excavate upon it had been issued by the Department of the Interior. This was being handled through the office of Jesse Nussbaum, who at that time was the man in charge of this kind of thing. Well, a couple of days later, a troubleshooter from the department arrived, and he was a toughie. He was a big, self-confident man whose name, I think, was Kinsley, or something close to that, and he had been sent out to fix things up, which he assured us he could do with little or no trouble. He arrived one afternoon and spent the night at the Long house where the rest of us lived. The next morning he set out, all by himself, to persuade Mr. Foster of his error. Mr. Kinsley returned late that afternoon, a chastened man. He said, "That Foster's a tough character. He's a hard man." Well, why? What happened? Well, it seems that Mr. Kinsley had gone over with assurance and bravado, perhaps, to talk Mac Foster out of his opposition. And in order to ingratiate himself with Mac, he had offered to chop wood, or to assist Mac in chopping wood, and he had borrowed an axe. His vigor was too much for the axe, and he broke the handle, which caused Mac Foster to resort again to his gun and chase Mr. Kinsley off his premises. Ultimately, however, this was worked out because Mac was in a vulnerable position legally, inasmuch as he had not actually proved up on his land, and Mr. Kinsley, therefore, was in the driver's seat, and a compromise was reached whereby the archaeologists were not permitted to drive over Mr. Foster's regular road, and they repaired the cattle guard, of course, and we built a new road which came into the ruin by a devious route over public land, so that access could still be had to the ruin, although the trip there was a little inconvenient. I stayed that summer, I guess about 4 months, and worked just as a laborer, digging dirt in the Lowry ruin and learning a little bit about the procedures of archaeology, and enjoying it very much, both from the point of view of its intellectual interest and the physical betterment of being out in the open and digging in the dirt. But as I said before, I think even more so through the meeting with people and a society, the like of which I had never seen before. Stop it a minute, because I don't actually know. I mean, that was what the story I've told you was hearsay from what Kinsley told us. But what I would like to do now is refer to a few other people who lived in that neighborhood and whose character, as I said, interested me very much. Let's begin first with Mr. and Mrs. Long. As I said, Paul himself and...
How do you spell that? L-O-N-G?
Yes. Clyde, C-L-Y-D-E, initial D, Long, L-O-N-G. Mr. and Mrs. Long had homesteaded some years before on several hundred acres of sagebrush. Mr. Long had been born in Nebraska, where he had grown up on a cattle ranch. He had later had a career of wandering, living in Mexico for a while, at one time, according to his story, being a professional or semi-professional pugilist. And I believe that because although he was small, he was a strong, wiry man. His wife was a city girl from some moderate-sized town in Wisconsin or Minnesota, I don't remember. And he and she had been married in Mexico, where they had met. I don't know those circumstances. Later, however, when they came to homestead this land, Mr. Long had had a serious illness, and he had had surgery to his intestine, which caused the removal of most of his intestines, so that thereafter he was unable to eat a normal diet or to evacuate through normal channels. He had a tube in his side. This didn't stop him, however. He and his wife, and this of course is again hearsay to me, but it is what they told us, and I have confidence in the truth. They had been driven to their land in a 2-horse wagon. Mr. Long unable to sit up or to handle the horses, and Mrs. Long almost totally inexperienced in problems of this kind. They drove to their land. Somehow they built a house out of brush or logs, I don't know. They cleared some sagebrush, they planted beans, and they survived. I wish I knew more about the details of this, but that's the essential outline. By the time that Paul Martin, some years later, made their acquaintance and went into that country to excavate, he made an arrangement with the Longs, and he helped them financially to build a new house, which, however, was still a house of logs with a sod roof, but it had a plank floor and was quite a reasonable 4-room building. Mrs. Long cooked for us, and she was a marvelous cook. And Paul himself slept in the Long house. The rest of us, 3 or 4 people, lived in tents just outside. Mr. Long was around, but was still unable to work, though he could get around, and he could milk the cow and things like that. Well, I maintained a pretty close friendship with the Longs throughout subsequent years until they both died, and it's a sort of happy ending in a way. After this period of homesteading poverty, they did sell their land later in the about 1950, I suppose, for what apparently was a fairly good profit. They bought a house trailer, and ultimately they went to Albuquerque to live, where they stayed until their death, and I don't remember that date. But they were wonderful, wonderful people, I suppose, just like many others who homesteaded on the American frontier, but they happened to be the only ones that I have ever known intimately. The rest of the community was heterogeneous. There were some very fine people who also had homesteaded like the Longs, mostly from the east or the middle east, middle west or the middle south. And there were also some bums. like the Foster family. One of the neighbors, however, represented a very remarkable group, and that was Alan Lancaster. Al was also from Tennessee. He had come into that region about the time of the First World War, in which he had served for a short time, and he had married there Alice Pigg, P-I-G-G. Alice Pigg was a school teacher in a little one-room school near Yellow Jacket, I think, at the time that they were married. Al had gone to school only a few years, never as far as high school, in a variety of places. He had originated in Tennessee. He had worked in the Texas oil field at Burke Burnett. He had lived in eastern Colorado. Then he had finally homesteaded in western Colorado. Alice was the daughter of East Tennessee mountain people. I remember her mother, who was known universally in the neighborhood as Old Lady Pig. Old Lady Pig was strictly out of Little Abner. She was illiterate, I guess. She smoked a corncob pipe, and she was as thin as any human being could be imaginably, a typical, hillbilly cartoon character. There were a number of other Pig children, and there were also, that is, siblings of Alice, and also a number of siblings of Al. But Al and Alice stood out above all the others. They lived, when I first met them in 1933, in a shacky sort of house that they had built on their homesteaded land covered with tar paper. But, and at that time they had several children. Ultimately they had 6. And it's interesting to know that every one of those 6 children has been to college. Every one of them has become what I should say is a remarkably successful person in all phases of living. The golden wedding anniversary of Al and Alice is another story that I'd like to mention later on, but not now. Well, Al, I came to know at this time, although he wasn't working for Paul Martin. He had worked for Paul Martin in previous years, but in the summer of 1933, he was employed by Joe Brew on the dig at Alkalai Ridge, Utah. Alkalai Ridge was a well-known area for early Southwestern archaeology. It had been originally investigated by Kidder and Morley in the very early days of the 20th century when they were still students at Harvard. And Kidder had recommended that further work be done there. Kidder was, at this time, engaged with the Carnegie Institution of Washington, living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where the Carnegie Historical Division, as it was called, had its office. So Joe Brew, who was then a graduate student at Harvard, was sent out to set up excavations at Alkalai Ridge. And I can't talk about that because I never had any part in the Alkalai Ridge operation. But I visited it and met Joe Brew through those visits, and again had a little observational experience in Southwestern archaeology. To go back to Paul Martin, he was engaged that year and for a couple of years later in the excavation of Lowry Ruin, which has become a fairly famous site in the history of Southwestern archaeology. It was essentially a Mesa Verde pueblo, and I worked there learning how to dig, if nothing else, with two or three other people whom Paul had brought into his circle. One of these people was a young man named Carl Lloyd, who was doesn't come into the story any further, but he was a son, I think, of a friend of Paul's. Another man who spent that summer with us was Pierce Butler. Pierce Butler has nothing to do with archaeology, but he was then librarian of the Newberry Library in Chicago, and a wonderful fellow. I won't expatiate on him because that's purely personal. Another member of the group, however, is significant archaeologically, and that was Robert Berg, B-U-R-G-H. Bob Berg, I could write a biography of him too, but I won't go into his personal background here, except to say that he had come from a Swedish farming family in a little town called Three Oaks, Michigan, which is in the southwest corner of Michigan. And he was interested locally, as a young man, in the history of the region, that part of Michigan, and rebelling against the life on the farm, which was very hard for him since he had pulmonary troubles, which bothered him all his life. He got involved in the development of a small museum. As he told me afterwards, this was done under largely under the encouragement of Carl Gutta, whom he had met somehow. And Gutta apparently liked Bob and encouraged him. Bob subsequently went to Purdue University for, I think, 2 years, but money and health prevented his continuing. And then, through means that I don't know, he got involved in the Southwest and went out, worked as a summer ranger at Mesa Verde for 2 or 3 years, I think, where he met Earl Morris and also Paul Martin. So when I went to Lowry Ruin in '33, Bob was a member of the staff, and his particular role was that of cartographer and surveyor. He was physically unable to do heavy work, but he had had training in college in surveying and the use of a transit and an alidade, and he made the maps and the drawings for the Lowry Ruin excavation. I'll come back to Bob in subsequent contexts later on. Well, as I said, all this summer and the social aspects that went with it were fascinating to me. The community of Sylvan had a schoolhouse where occasionally there would be a social gathering, even though school wasn't in session during the summer. This was still Prohibition time, and there was a resident bootlegger in the person of August Weinman. August Weinman, known as Og, ran a general store in a nearby village called Ackmen, A-C-K-M-E-N. Ackmen doesn't exist any longer. But Og was the postmaster and the storekeeper in that little crossroad. Og also supplied rot-gut liquor to the people at the school dances and other occasions like that. And in 1 or 2 cases that I can recall, pretty serious violence in the way of personal fights and gun shooting did occur, though I don't remember anybody getting very seriously hurt. Well, all this was kind of new to me too, and I reveled in it. It was, again, something out of the book, but here were the real people. I'll later have something to say about the demise of the town of Ackman and its transference into what is now called Pleasant View, but that didn't come yet. Well, for diversion, in addition to digging at the ruin, we used quite often to drive over to Mesa Verde. Our transportation was a 7-passenger 1915 Pierce Arrow touring car, which Paul had and which he drove out from Chicago, and in which he transported those of us who were digging at the ruin. He would make the crew consisted of Bob Berg and me and Carl Lloyd, and about half a dozen or 5 local young men who were employed by Paul. And they lived in the neighborhood, lived at home, and Paul would drive around with his great Pierce Arrow every morning and pick them up, take them over through this devious back road up to the ruin, and leave us there for the day. We would take our lunch. Then in the afternoon, Paul would come back with his Pierce Arrow and take us all home. Paul, to my knowledge, never spent more than about 1 hour consecutively at Lowry Ruin. I do not want this to be interpreted as a criticism of his archaeological capacity, although at the time I wondered. Paul had ill health. He had ill health, I guess, all his life, and he lived on a very carefully prepared diet. He had stomach ailments. Here. So that Mrs. Long, as the chatelaine and the cook, was necessary to Paul's well-being. Furthermore, he had to rest in the afternoon. Furthermore, he did the shopping for the camp and the crew by taking Mrs. Long in his Pierce Arrow into Cortez, about 15 miles away, approximately once a week, where they would shop and then drive out again. The roads in the whole area at that time were totally unimproved. They were graded dirt. But the clay of that region must have been like the clay that they talked about in Flanders in the First World War. It was utterly impassable when wet. And from what I have heard, impassable throughout most of the winter. Certainly when the torrential late summer rains came, it was practically impossible to drive any car, and in order to go to Cortez with a horse and wagon would be a 2-day trip. Well, as I said, Paul was engaged in activities other than direct supervision of the excavation. He would come in the morning and he would leave us, and he would give us instructions as to what was to be done. Dig here, dig there. Then he would come back in the afternoon, about an hour before quitting time, and would observe what had been done, and he would take notes in a field notebook. As I say, at the time, it seemed to me incredible that anybody spending so little time on the site could really know what was going on. I did Paul an injustice because, as I subsequently learned, he did know what was going on. His notes were adequate, and he was ultimately able to write a very thorough and very competent report. The foreman on the job was named Marion Clark. Marion Clark was an experience too. He might have been 40 years old. A very vigorous, very valuable, very intelligent, but not formally educated man. He'd had a colorful career. I don't know where he came from originally, but he had worked in the mines at Rico, Colorado. Rico is in the Dolores River Valley, up northeast from where we were. At the time we were there, the mining activity in all those places, Telluride and Rico and others, had stopped. But a few years earlier, it had been pretty active and pretty rough, I guess. Well, Marion was a roughneck. But he was a nice fellow and a bright fellow and a practical joker. Later, after the excavations at Lowry were all over, Marion became a labor organizer, and I don't know what ultimately happened to him. Well, we dug and did a pretty good job, I guess. At the end of that, I should say also that we frequently, and usually on weekends, would take a trip in the Great Pierce Arrow. Often those trips were to Mesa Verde, which was not very far away, about 25 miles. In fact, you could see Mesa Verde very clearly from the long house where we lived. The long house was on a high ridge, and Mesa Verde, though some distant, a good many miles, was very clearly visible. Well, Mesa Verde in those days was a comparatively simple outpost of the Park Service. They had paved the road from Mancus up to the top of the park, but the number of visitors was small. I don't remember how many per year, and the personnel was small and very intimate. So this was a very pleasant place to go. Bob Berg, who was part of our crew, had, as I said, previously worked at Mesa Verde as a summer ranger. He knew the other people there, and through him and them, we always had a very pleasant social time. The personnel at Mesa Verde was roughly as follows. The superintendent then was a man named Marshall Finnan. Marshall Finnan was a young man who had a year or two previously succeeded Jesse Nussbaum as superintendent. The park naturalist, so-called, who was sort of the second in command, was Paul Frank, F-R-A-N-K-E. Paul Frank had a later career in the Park Service and ultimately retired and died in Santa Fe. A wonderfully nice man with whom I kept up a close friendship. Don Watson, who became a word to bat about in the Southwest, was the chief ranger at that time. He later became park naturalist after Paul had left, and then later left the park and became a trader. I won't talk about Don Watson particularly, though he has a place in the Southwest in many ways. There were other people up there that I remember very cordially and with great affection and esteem. Also, during that summer of 1933 in the Pierce Arrow, Paul and I and Pierce Butler and Bob and Marion Clark made a trip down across the Western Navajo Reservation. We went over through Monticello, down through Bluff City, Mexican Hat to Cayenta. At Cayenta, I recall, we undid our sleeping bags and stayed there in the backyard of the Wetherill home and trading post. Then we drove on eastward to Ganado, Chinle, ultimately coming out at Gallup. Well, this was an experience for me, too. At that date, the Navajo Reservation was still only rarely visited by travelers or tourists. Roads were sort of roads, and I remember I have some pictures of pushing the Pierce Arrow out of the arroyos or digging it out. But we made it, and this was lots of fun. Well, by the end of that summer, I had become thoroughly indoctrinated in the idea of archaeology in the Southwest. I think I have to say that perhaps, in my mind then and still, archaeology means the Southwest, and the Southwest means the San Juan. I don't think I have ever broadened my horizon since that first that first prejudice. Well, I left Lowry when the season closed, which was in, I guess, late September. And I went to California. What happened in the next, that winter is of no consequence. But the next summer, I had enjoyed the first year so much that I wrote to Paul Martin and asked if I could be permitted to return the second summer. He gave me permission to do so, and I went back and spent a second summer at Lowry Ruin, and without significant events of any moment, but just a reinforcement, so to speak, of my own delight in the country, in the people, in the geography, in the history, in everything, even in the archaeology. And that fall, I spread myself out a little bit by visiting other ruins in the Southwest, such as Aztec, by going down onto the Navajo reservation at Shiprock and watching a Yebechai, by going to the Shalako at Zuni, and meeting various people. And then I went back to California. This is the autumn of 1934. By this time, I had begun to think seriously of devoting myself subsequently to archaeology, but the means to do this in a practical sense were not apparent. I had studied law, as I said, and I had practiced law. I didn't want to return to it. I didn't want to return to the East. I didn't want to return to the practice of the law. I would love to have dug in the dirt in Colorado for the rest of my life, but how do you do that? In the course of that winter, or in the early part of that, no, I'm wrong. My chronology is incorrect. The preceding winter of 1933-34, I had been in Berkeley, California, where I had met a remarkable man. His name was Max Radin, R-A-D-I-N. Max Radin was the dean of the University of California Law School. He was also the brother of Paul Radin, who was a well-known anthropologist in Middle America. Max was a dynamic character, and I met him socially, and being aware of who he was and what he was, I discussed my problem with him. I put to him the question, here I am with a good many years invested in a legal education which I don't want to pursue, an interest, but only an amateurish one, in archaeology. What can I do about this? Max Radin was the kind of fellow who took the ball away from you and threw it right back. He had the answer, and he was so persuasive that he sold it to me. The answer was that I should come to the University of California under his aegis, and I should take some courses, some in the law school and some in anthropology, that this would fit me for something new under the sun, which he envisaged, but which I was vague in my mind, namely the combination of legal studies with anthropological study. At that time, in 1934, the idea of serious legal investigations of what are called primitive peoples, that is to say, non-literate peoples, was a very new thing. Subsequently, it has become, it's followed by a lot of people. Ad Hobo, I guess, was probably the pioneer in the United States in developing this. Well, this all sounded wonderful to me, so I did spend the winter of 34 and 35 in Berkeley following this course, still not being very clear as to what it was all about, but taking some courses under Max's direction in advanced legal theory and philosophy, and some rather elementary courses in anthropology. Kroeber and Lowy were there at that time. Well, this was a very happy winter, and I enjoyed my studies, and I enjoyed the people that I met. I enjoyed living in San Francisco Bay. That was before the bridges were built. Toward the end of the year, however, in the spring of 35, fortuitously, I met another strange character. I'm always meeting strange characters by mistake. This one was Ansel Franklin Hall, A-N-S-E-L, Franklin, H-A-L-L. Ansel Hall was at that time director of the National Park Service Research Center. I don't remember exactly what it was called, which was located in Berkeley. And Ansel had been a career man in the National Park Service. He was now in upper middle age. He was a queer combination of shrewd promoter and romantic idealist. I never knew, in my subsequent acquaintance with him, which of those characteristics dominated the other. I think they were pretty even. He had a love of nature and the outdoors. He also had a romantic concept of the desirability of introducing boys or young men to the outdoors and to nature. Now, this, of course, fits in with the philosophy, the idealism of the Park Service, of which Ansel Hall was an exemplar. But he was also a promoter, as I've said. So he conceived an idea. The idea subsequently crystallized in something which came to be known as the Rainbow Bridge Monument Valley Expedition. Ansel started that. He had started it, I think, in 1933, 2 years before I met him. And the concept was this. He would organize it. He would undertake to raise the financial backing for it. He would induce teachers of the natural sciences to join it for 2 or 3 months in the summer, and he would induce students of college age to come and pay their way for the privilege of living out in the wilderness somewhere, communing with nature and with their fellows in a simple environment, and at the same time acquiring practical knowledge of fieldwork in geology, meteorology, botany, anthropology, archaeology, all the natural sciences under qualified professorial supervision. Well, a wonderful notion. And when I met Ansel Hall and heard about this, well, I first heard about the expedition when I was in Berkeley, because Ansel was advertising it. And he did advertise it very fully all over the United States on college campuses. And he had the backing also of the Explorers Club in New York, of which he was a member. He had been successful in 2 preceding summers in getting teachers to come, many of them from the East, as well as from Western colleges, and in inducing students to join them. And I heard about this, and I met Ansel Hall, and I thought, oh, mercy, this is wonderful. So I propositioned him, and I said, how about, will you take me on as an archaeological staff member? And I inflated my 2 years' experience at Lowry Ruin to the extent that Ansel said, why, yes. So I was employed as an staff archaeologist with precious little knowledge, and in June, with an expedition of, I don't know, half a dozen or maybe 10 automobiles, we set out from Berkeley for the western Navajo country, our ultimate base being the Wetherill Ranch in Cayena. Well, when I got there, there were 2 other young men who were also staff archaeologists like me. One of them was George Brainerd. George Brainerd had a subsequent career in Middle America and finally died prematurely. But at that summer, George was even more innocent than I of the anthropology or archaeology of that area. He had been a student at Lafayette University in marine biology, and later had got a doctor's degree in that same subject at Ohio State. He had then gone to teach at a mission school in Tehran, Iran. While he was in Tehran, I think he spent 2 or 3 years there, he met Eric Schmidt. Eric Schmidt was then at the University of Pennsylvania carrying on archaeological investigations in Iran. And George, sort of like me in a different context, had become enamored of the idea of digging in the dirt, and he somehow infiltrated himself into Eric Schmidt's expedition. Then he came back to the United States, and he, like me, had been enamored of what he heard of the Rainbow Bridge Monument Valley expedition, and had been taken on by Ansel Hall. The third staff archaeologist was another Hall, no relation to Ansel, whose name was Edward T. Ned was then a good deal younger than I. Ned was only about 21 or 22. And his qualifications were these. He had been born in St. Louis into, I gathered, a home of considerable wealth. The family fortune was invested in Purina chows. Ned had gone to a boarding school at Los Alamos, at where there was a well-known boarding school for a good many years before the atom bomb. And then somehow hard times, remember this is Depression time, had fallen upon the family, and Ned was pretty much on his own, I think. He had got a job working for the WPA and the Navajo and the Indian Service, and he had spent a couple of summers up there in the western Navajo country working with Navajo crews building small check dams. One of the major things that federal money, which was being siphoned into the Indian world through WPA and through the Indian Bureau, was, at least in that arid region, the building of small check dams all over little arroyos and big arroyos to mitigate the very serious erosion. And a lot of these dams were built, and I think they did a service. Well, Ned had a couple of years bossing Navajo crews and building dams, and I don't think he knew how to build a dam except to pour it in a lot of dirt and stone. Now he was staff archaeologist for the Rainbow Bridge expedition. So George and Ned and I were the department. We had a number of college students who had come out there to learn about archaeology, and it was our business to teach them, and I think we did. We learned with them, but I think it was a successful operation. I ought to say, however, that we were mightily assisted in this by Ben Wetherill. And I'd like to talk somewhere in this conversation about the whole Wetherill connection insofar as I knew it. I think I'll do that later. But for the moment, let me say that Ansel Hall had employed John Wetherill, who was the youngest of the original Wetherill brothers and who at this time was running the trading post at Kayenta. He had employed John as outfitter for the expedition. That is to say, John was to supply horses, tents, equipment of all kinds. John's son, Ben, who had grown up on the Navajo reservation and once said that he thought more easily in Navajo than he did in English. I imagine that was true because his English was never very lucid. Ben had also backyard experience as an archaeologist. Some would have said a pot hunter. But he knew about the ruins, of course, through the Wetherill tradition and through his own experience. So I really ought to include him, I guess, in the archaeological faculty of the expedition. That first year, well, it wasn't the first year, but it was my first year, a base camp was established exactly in Marsh Pass. Marsh Pass is about 10 or 12 miles west of Kayenta, where the road crosses a little divide and then continues on westward to Cow Springs and Red Lake and on finally into Flagstaff. There are a few more spectacular spots, I think, in the southwest than Marsh Pass. Our camp was right at the high point of it, and we looked out from our tents directly to the north up Laguna Creek, which is to say the Sagi Canyon. Our excavations that summer were mostly within the upper reaches of the Sagi Canyon. As an indication of the organizational complexity that Ansel Hall was capable of, we had a base camp, as I said, at Marsh Pass. There was a large eating hall with a kitchen attached. There were several board wooden structures built for the purpose of use as laboratory. We had a photographic darkroom. We had, of course, a storehouse for food and supplies, and then we had a few tents in which the more dignified members slept, but most of us slept in sleeping bags just on the ground in the open. Well, out of that base camp, subsidiary or fly camps were established from time to time and from place to place. The first one that I experienced was about 12 miles up the Sagi, right up the main stream. And that was another outdoor affair. We had a tent which housed the cook and the cooking arrangement and sheltered the stores, but everything else was just open country. We slept on the ground or often in caves. It turns out that up there are a lot of nice caves. And of course the Anasazi knew that and occupied them. But we found it out too, so that in the little amphitheater where this camp was established, and there was also a spring of water, there were little ledges and caves in the canyon walls in which we slept. Very cozy. The total personnel of the Rainbow Bridge expedition varied from year to year and from time to time, but during the 3 summers that I spent with it, it ranged from 40 to 60. It was not a small operation, and the business of feeding, instructing, because that was part of its purpose, managing and supplying and transporting all those people was no small thing. To return to the camp up the Segi, our archaeological function there was to make a survey of the whole upper range of the Segi Canyon. Now, lots of people had dug ruins, Kidder and Guernsey way back, Noel Morris. This was all known, but nobody had ever made a systematic study of the distribution of peoples, the settlement patterns, so to speak. So we used to go out in the morning, 2 of us usually together, and we would walk up and down the canyon, up and down the side canyons at different levels. See, there are several different river terraces in that area, which of course had a dating significance. We would locate sites, give them a number, write down their description and location, pick up a collection of potsherds and so forth in the standard survey manner. Well, we did this for several weeks, I think fairly competently and fairly systematically, until we had pretty well exhausted the upper reaches of the Segi Canyon. And then that camp was abandoned,